In this module, we're going to discuss substance use disorders. I'm going to present a very brief overview to you to orient you to the neuroscience of addiction and some of the implications for substance use disorders in the legal system. First, the neuroscience of addictions. Social, environmental, and developmental risk factors all contribute to the development of substance use disorders. So, things like adverse childhood experiences. There are genetic variabilities in the vulnerability to addiction. Periods of high risk that correlate with a particular susceptibility to addictions. This occurs in, for example, early childhood, later adolescence, and emerging adulthood, which are both high risk for developing a new addiction and high risk for how that addiction is going to impact the brain. While each substance has a unique set of complications and a different treatment approach, they do have a common set of brain mechanisms, which I'm going to go over. So in the most general terms, the neurotransmitter dopamine causes drug-induced structural and functional changes in the brain. So every drug with addiction potential has effects on dopamine with downstream implications for other neurotransmitters depending on the substance. Dopamine and its helpers help power a very well-known cycle of drug use. How you progress through those stages of drug use will depend on both the frequency of use and the intensity with which you use. These phases are important to understand. There are three phases: the binge or intoxication phase, followed by the withdrawal or negative affective stage, and then finally the preoccupation or anticipation stage, what would be colloquially known as the craving stage. This cycle goes round and round and intensifies over time, causing greater neurological and psychological harm. The positive reinforcement of a drug tends to diminish over time. And that means if you are using this substance, you need more and more of it to get the same feeling, what we call tolerance. The withdrawal stage also becomes more intense, leading to greater stress, depression, physical illness. You no longer use drugs to be happy in that stage. That's a misconception. Drug use perpetuated by that stage is to avoid despair and to avoid pain. And finally, preoccupation and craving, where the intensity of need and the pursuit of the substance becomes the central focus of attention and activity. The cycle isn't imaginary. It has a location in the brain and structures that support the cycle. Those structures are the ones that subserve reward, motivation, and learning, the formation of habits, the generation of stress and emotions, and the loosening of inhibitory controls and a decrease in impulse regulation. So the behaviors that we see in people who have substance use disorders correlate with the brain regions that those substances affect. That's why neuroscientists in the field of addiction call this brain hijacking, where substances take control over normal functioning. It's important to understand the attributes of addiction that might be misunderstood in the legal system, and I want to go over three of them. First, treatment works. While it's true that substance use disorders can be chronic, and that those substance use disorders are often relapsing, particularly in the presence of stress, modern treatments work. Modern treatments are effective. They significantly improve the likelihood of abstinence and meaningful function. In contrast to the old narrative that substance use disorders were character flaws, we now know that substance use disorders are chronic, relapsing illnesses characterized by impaired social functioning, poor health, and impaired control over use. And interestingly, the relapse rates of substance use disorders are similar to other chronic disorders like asthma and hypertension and diabetes. When you put those illnesses side by side, actually, substance use disorders are associated with higher positive response rates than those other chronic illnesses. What do you need? You need good treatment. You need evidence-based care. That's a proper evaluation with careful and detailed history, integrated pharmacologic, cognitive, behavioral, and psychodynamic and self-help group treatment, and simultaneous, not sequential, simultaneous treatment of comorbid psychiatric disorders as it is the rule and not the exception that people with substance use disorders often have comorbid other psychiatric disorders. Second, begin substance use disorder treatment at the first possible moment. Do not wait until release for someone who is detained. The medical community has reached a very clear consensus. Treat immediately, early, and as often as possible. Treatment should begin in detention with a combination of both detention and community-based treatment programs. There are some corollaries to the notion of continuous treatment. First, intensive short-term treatment isn't as good as long-term treatment, and understand that relapse happens early and often across all different substance types. And finally, with the treat early approach, you can see, and data shows, that this reduces substance use relapse, reduces drug-related recidivism and reincarceration, and also reduces the rate of immediate and fatal overdose upon discharge from the facility. Finally, all substance use is not the same. Treatment has to be tailored to the type of substance being used and its unique characteristics. Failure to account for those differences can actually undermine both treatment, compliance, and success, and the demands of the legal system. It can also undermine physical safety, as it can be life-threatening. We have only time for a couple of examples, but for example, the use of high-potency cannabis in large amounts can cause chronic psychotic illness. Chronic amphetamine or methamphetamine use impairs executive functioning and interferes with memory. Opioids and synthetic opioids are famously lethal in overdose, but alcohol withdrawal is actually famous for being possibly causing seizures, delirium, and death in withdrawal, not an overdose. The bottom line here is to make sure you examine the common neurological impairments in substance use disorder, but often the particular signatures of the drug in question and its impact on brain and behavior. Thank you for your attention.